One of the most happiest occasions that I had as QM was the dinner in Ortona. With the cooperation of all my men and my staff, we were able to put on what was known then as the impossible Christmas dinner served on Christmas Day to all and each and every one of our troops.
First of all, you had to get all the food. So the army rations weren't enough. We always had a certain amount of money, so I was sent down back farther and picked up all kinds of vegetables and meat and one thing another and so on and so forth. And I never told the fellows how they fertilized the fields in Italy because they wouldn't have eaten the dinner. But then the dinner ran in the afternoon, and we brought one company in at a time. And after they'd had their meal, they went out, and then the other company came in, and then they went out, and so on until it began to get dark. And of course, we were running short of lights. We had no electricity or anything like that. And they started to light candles, and I began a little bit squeamish about this lighting candles. The Germans were just outside, but they said, "Oh, it's quite safe. They can't see us here." And I noticed in the church there was a great big gaping hole in the wall, and the light would certainly come through. But the chap that was just here a little minute ago, Gildersleeve, was there, and he played the organ. The padre and sanitary guide, Leo Gregg, sang songs, mostly Christmas carols, and the pipe major, of course, played his pipes.
And I'll never forget it as long as I live. In the heat of the battle, we had the most wonderful dinner that you could imagine. Roast pork, applesauce, a chocolate bar, a bottle of beer, nuts and candy. Imagine this, in December 1943, Christmas Day. Well, this was a real treat.
And I think I should mention that if it wasn't for Colonel Thompson, I don't think we would have had this carried out. But Colonel Thompson, somewhat of a character like myself, and a person that is prepared to do anything for the welfare of the troops, he says, "Borden, go for it." So we went for it. And if I say I look back on it now, I think that's the most memorable occasion, especially when I saw the men come in from out street fighting and walk into the church and see the expression on the men's faces at that time. As far as they were concerned, they never had the slightest dream that there would be a Christmas dinner for them on that occasion. It would be nothing but hardship, toil, sweat and tears on that occasion. But when they walked into the church that day and sat down to a Christmas dinner, the expression on their face was the greatest thrill I ever had. And I'm telling you, the greatest reward I had for what we were able to do for them.
On Christmas Day, our company, I was in D company, and we were told we were going back to Christmas dinner, company by company. D company I was in, we were the last one in. We got into the church about 5 o'clock at night, and it was just getting dark. And we walked in there, and here's Borden Cameron, our quartermaster, and the dinner all lined up. Quite unsettling in a way, because everything was still going around us. Still a lot of firing going on lined up. So we sat down at tables, and where we got the knives and forks and stuff from, I do not know. But anyway, we had a proper Christmas dinner. It was lamb. Pork. And after the dinner was over, about 9 o'clock at night, we bunked down right in the church. We couldn't move forward because we didn't know. Everything was blowing into the streets. We couldn't move without making a noise. So we just stayed in the church, and the next morning we moved back up into the line, which was about 4 or 5 blocks away. And we were designated an area that we were to work in, and we just carried on moving through the town, and we got to the end of the town, overlooking Gully, on December the 30th, and that was the Battle of Ortona.
December 1943 saw the 1st Canadian Division in action on the Adriatic coast of Italy, trying to press the German defenders back to where they thought the Gustav Line had been established. As the battle progressed, it was realized that the German defenses were farther south than had been expected, and that they were in fact anchored on the eastern flank, in the town of Ortona. This precipitated one of the most celebrated and dogged battles yet experienced by the Canadians in the Italian campaign. The better part of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade, with support from the tanks of the 1st Canadian Armoured Brigade, were drawn into an urban battle unique in its intensity and character thus far. In the midst of all this, one of the battalions committed to the fight, the Seaforths Highlanders of Canada, were to pull off the impossible. They would serve Christmas dinner to their troops, with the Germans only a few hundred yards away. This would go down in regimental history as the Ortona dinner, and would later capture the imagination of the country. By 1900 hours on Christmas Day, the last company had been fed, and those who were responsible and those who partook in the little bit of Yuletide celebration in the midst of the death and destruction of battle knew that they had witnessed something truly special. The only record of it lay in the minds and the memories of those who had been there, or did it. As the century progressed, a photograph entered the collective mindset of the country, and indeed the world. The internet further spread the photograph, and without any bona fide record of the dinner, it quickly became a way to illustrate it. In time, however, a deep desire to have some record of this famous event led the picture to be directly associated with the dinner. This video will clarify the photographic record of the Ortona dinner of the Seaforths Highlanders of Canada. It's important to keep in mind that although photographs can be a great help in discovering history, they sometimes are not all that we want them to be. Here, in this famous photograph taken in December 1943, 3 Canadian soldiers are shown purportedly in action. When we examine the full shot and those taken at the same instance, things are not always as they seem. The town of Ortona, Italy, holds a very special place in Canadian military history. Located on the Adriatic coast of Italy, it lies on a significant prominence of land surrounded by deep ravines, cliffs, and the sea. Given its topography, no wonder the battle fought there in 1943 was so fierce. There was no room for maneuver, and it lent itself decidedly to the defense. The town is not overly large, and in 1943 it was even smaller. The main part of it, the oldest, or Old Town, was a maze of streets, alleys, and lanes that were in many instances impossibly narrow, barring all but men in single file. As mentioned, the town was a good deal smaller than it is currently. Most of what would become the new part of town to the south had not yet been built. This left the southern approaches coming out of the gully largely open. The main route into town was Highway 16. The church of Santa Maria de Constantinople stood semi-isolated, perched near the top of a cliff overlooking the Adriatic. The road from the church into town met Highway 16 at a square at the edge of town known as the Piazza Vittoria. From there, the main part of the town began, with its characteristic congested buildings. There were few roads wide enough to take military traffic, and only one main one that went through town, the Corso Vittorio Emanuele, which terminated at the Piazza Municipale, or Town Square. From there, the streets and buildings continued past the magnificent Cathedral of San Tommaso to the ancient castle on the northern edge of town. We can see here in this southern oblique view the significant elevation the town held above the sea. The cliffs were steep, climbing some 230 feet from the shoreline. In addition, the open nature of the approaches from the south. Here again we can see the significant elevation of the town and the area around the church. The shoreline could certainly not be seen from the buildings perched atop. In these aerial photographs, the Piazza Vittoria and the road extending to the upper right, leading to the church. This next shot shows the buildings lining the road to the church and the otherwise open nature of the southern approaches, with Highway 16 at the bottom of the frame. The southern approaches were defined by a deep ravine known as the Gully. The road required switchbacks to ascend the slope, and from here the ground gently sloped down towards the town, off camera to the left. While a detailed examination of the battle is certainly not the preserve of this video, a certain overview might be useful in placing the events of the 25th of December in better context. The fighting in Ortona was the climax of a battle that began for the Canadians to the south in order to cross the Moreau River. It was there that the 1st Canadian Division took up the advance and engaged in difficult fighting in crossing both the Moreau River and a dry riverbed known as the Gully further north. There were destined to be 3 units involved in the fighting in Ortona: the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, both infantry battalions of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade, and the tanks of the Three Rivers Regiment, part of the 1st Canadian Armoured Brigade. Until August of 1943, that formation had been known as the 1st Canadian Army Tank Brigade, and the 2 terms will be used interchangeably throughout this video. While not committed in full regimental strength, its squadrons supported at various times the infantry companies as they fought house to house to clear the town. The attack began with a main effort down Highway 16 by the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, with 1 company of Seaforths attached and a few tanks of the Three Rivers. This effort was supported by an attack by the Seaforths C Company, up from the gully and onto the plateau in the area of the Church of Santa Maria de Constantinople. With the southern approaches clear, the attack developed into a much more committed action, with the Eddies continuing to push down the Corso Emanuele towards the Piazza Municipale, and the Seaforths moving to the left flank in battalion strength, pushing through the west of the town, heading for the Piazza San Francesco. The fighting became unlike anything yet experienced by Canadian troops fighting in Italy, and various training techniques were fully exploited in slowly but surely gaining the upper hand. The fighting was house to house, which destroyed much of the city. The tanks of the Three Rivers Regiment supported where possible, but the streets that were able to accommodate them were few in number. By the 24th of December, the fighting in the Seaforth sector had reached the Piazza San Francesco, which was surrounded by a school, a hospital, and a church. This area became known as Dead Horse Square, due to an unfortunate animal that lay in its midst, killed in the fighting. The Seaforths had been in action at various times since the beginning of December, and in the town proper since the 21st, fighting constantly. Nerves were on edge, and despite the companies rotating through frontline duties, the battalion was tired. It was at this time, with Yuletide approaching, that a decision was made that would forever mark Christmas 1943 in the regimental history. Principally organized by 3 men, the Padre Roy Durnford, the quartermaster, Captain Borden Cameron, and of course the regimental quartermaster sergeant, WO2 Stan Welburn, arrangements were made to lay on a Christmas dinner for the men of the Seaforths. While this would have been a commonplace out of the line, the impossibility of the task was that it was to be organized, staged, and executed, whilst the battalion was still in action. The meal has become iconic in regimental lore. Soup, pork with mashed potatoes and gravy, mixed vegetables, a bottle of beer per man, mincemeat pie, and some candies and nuts for extras. Apart from the actual food and supplies needed to present such an effort, a location was needed that was close enough to the fighting so that the companies could get there without too much trouble, and it needed to be safe enough to house them, as they would still be well within the range of German mortars and artillery. Thus, the battalion headquarters at the Church of Santa Maria de Constantinople was chosen, as its thick walls would give protection, and it was on the outskirts of town. Little did they realize that this would become one of the most celebrated events in regimental history, and its unique story would eventually capture the imagination of a country. The church is actually mentioned and located by grid reference in the battalion war diary. It's mentioned in relation to the attack of C Company up from the gully on the 20th of December, and again after the battle on the 6th of January, where its churchyard is designated as the regimental burial ground. The Seaforths had captured the church after climbing the slopes from the gully on the 21st of December. Since then, it had been used as a company headquarters for Charlie Company, and soon after, it became the battalion headquarters, as the remainder of the Seaforths were committed to the left flank in the fight for the town. The church was not particularly large, but had some features of its construction worthy of note. Captured in film earlier in the battle, we see here men of the Seaforths returning to its confines. The 3-arch neoclassical porchway covered the main entrance, while a two-story annex or cloister with its own entrance was built on its eastern side. A wall extended out from here, behind which lay the church courtyard. On the 22nd of December, just 3 days before the dinner, a German mortar barrage fell on the church and its environs. This damaged the buildings and destroyed a truck and jeep parked outside on the track that led back to the gully. They burned for some time, long enough in fact to be captured on film, both still and motion picture. This was by no means a completely safe sanctuary, but was the best location that could be had. All around lay the detritus of war. Behind the Sherman tank parked outside, we can see the front of the church with its adjacent annex on the left side of the photograph. To the south and east, the church was flanked by open field, which would later become the initial resting place for the Seaforth dead. We can see here the peculiar annex which extended out from the rear corner, which gave an L shape to the overall plan of the church structure. In this well-known photograph of Seaforth men moving along the coast south of the gully, we can clearly see the church perched upon the high bluff, with the rear of the church visible, along with the belfry and rear of the L annex. The same view can be had in the accompanying cine film. Here, as the 17-pounders of the Divisional Anti-Tank Regiment and the Shermans of the Three Rivers Regiment engaged German positions in the Old Town, the church is conspicuous on the left. In this composite photograph of the Seaforth burial service, the eastern side of the church makes for important study. The front or facade can clearly be seen to the right, and the L-shaped annex furthest to the left, extending out towards the assembled battalion. Behind the trees we can see a wall enclosing the courtyard with an earthen bank at its foot, on which a second grouping of men stand, elevating them above those in front. The eastern wall extends behind them to join with the north wall, fully enclosing the courtyard. The cine film, taken at the same time, shows again the arrangement of church, annex, and walls. The men elevated on the earthen bank, and the wall to their back is well in evidence. We can also see in this shot the proximity to the cliff edge further to the east, and some 200 feet below, the Adriatic stretching out to the horizon. The interior of the church was plain, yet spacious enough for the numbers of men who would eventually fill its interior. This image dates from the 7th of January and is quite obviously a service or briefing given to troops of the Royal Canadian Armoured Corps, conspicuous in their black berets. In this photograph, likely dating to the post-war period, we can see the remnants of the courtyard, the surrounding wall having been removed. The L-shaped annex is still present, of course, with the belfry proud of the roofline. Thus, we can piece together the plan or layout of the church and its environs. The road from town terminated at the front of the church and its covered porchway. A track led off to the south towards the gully. To the rear of the church was generally open field, and the L annex formed its distinctive shape. The wall extended forward from the annex to enclose the courtyard and the parallel annex or cloister within. Outside was the earthen bank and the eventual location of the Seaforth burial ground. Perhaps a bit pedantic, these details, however, are crucial in understanding the church and the surrounding area with regards to the dinner. As mentioned, the plan for the 25th was to bring in each of the 4 rifle companies in succession, feed them, and allow for some rest in a 2-hour window beginning at 1100 hours and lasting until 1900 hours. By all accounts, it was monumentally successful. The men, tired, unshaven and dirty from days of heavy fighting, could relax and let their guard down once safe inside. Carols were sung, and the pipe major even played some tunes. The signals officer, Wilf Gildersleeve, played carols and hymns on the church organ. Sadly for some, it would in fact be their last meal. When it was all said and done, however, had there been any record of the dinner made? A picture, perhaps? Today, if you Google Ortona dinner, you will find all kinds of references to it accompanied by a certain photograph. It is one of the most iconic photographs taken of Canadian troops in the Second World War, and serves as a touchstone to the fact that despite the hardship, death, and destruction of war, there can and will still be moments of normality and indeed cheer carved out of the chaos. Truly a representative image if there ever was one. But is this image of the Seaforth Ortona dinner? If you go by the captions typically accompanying the photo, then yes. Perhaps, however, due diligence encourages us to look into this just a bit, and by that I mean a lot deeper. Strap in, because this is going to be one hell of a ride. The first step in delving into this seemingly straightforward but currently contentious issue is to examine the actual photograph in as much detail as possible. Let's look first at the physical environment. Though typically cropped out, the full image shows at the very top left a glimpse of a white balustrade with very distinctive construction. This appears to change direction at close to right angles, diverting towards the general direction of the camera. Set just in front is what we'll call the kiddie table. Clearly just another sitting, it does however echo that oft-practiced custom observed during large family dinners. Everything is set on a flat, clean concrete patio, which is in relatively decent condition. The table is covered in mess tins, oranges, food, beer, and small packets of some sort, all to a varying degree. There is an olive tree growing at the rear, in front of a substantial brick retaining wall, complete with drainage holes. This gently curves as it stretches away out of the shot. Under modest scrutiny, there appears to be some degree of commotion occurring at the right leg of the table, which has drawn the attention of a great many of those sitting, they having turned in their chairs or craning their necks to see what the fuss is all about. It would appear that something, food, cigarettes, or the like, has arrived and everyone is anxious to have some. In total, there are 63 men in the photo, with one hidden from view behind the serving man at the right of the photograph. They are wearing the typical dress of the Second World War, known as battle dress, in all but a couple of instances, and it is in relation to this dress that we shall begin our examination of the men themselves. There is one other aspect that we should bear in mind. Army custom for Christmas dinners is that the officers, along with the senior NCOs and warrant officers, will serve the meal to their troops. A symbolic gesture of thanks and the maintenance of the good welfare of their men. We shall see this aspect exemplified throughout our examination. Before we continue, it's important that we establish what we might be looking at with regards to units, the men, and their uniforms. I have selected those presented here based on an understanding of who may have been operating in the greater Ortona area. The Seaforth Highlanders of Canada wore a cap badge consisting of a stag's head on a Mackenzie tartan patch. This was worn on a tam o' shanter, which shouldn't be confused with a beret due to the presence of a pom-pom or turi in the center of the crown. Their shoulder flash was blue with buff or off-white lettering. They wore the red patch of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division. The Loyal Edmonton Regiment wore a badge consisting of the number 49 and a coyote's head set on the blades of a windmill. This was worn on the field service cap, in common with much of the Army, and their shoulder flash was grey with green lettering. They too wore the red patch of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division. The Three Rivers Regiment had a badge featuring their initials, surrounded by a wreath of maple leaves. This was worn on the distinctive black beret of the Royal Canadian Armour Corps, as all tank regiments would. Their shoulder flash was blue with a red border and yellow lettering. They wore the patch of the 1st Canadian Army Tank Brigade, often with their own variation. The Royal Canadian Army Service Corps were the logistics troops of the Army, and primarily found in rear areas. Their badge of a royal cipher with scroll on a star-shaped backing was worn on the field service cap, and their shoulder flash was blue with a white border and pale yellow lettering. As for formation patches, they would wear whichever was appropriate, depending on what division or brigade they served in. Finally, the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals were the communications troops of the Army. They maintained the greater signals apparatus within the Army, including radio and telephones. Their badge of Nike, in a wreath of maple leaves, was worn on a field service cap, and their shoulder flash was a simple one, white lettering on blue, although some variations did occur. Their formation patch would, like the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps, be appropriate to whatever division or brigade they served in. Those in the headquarters of the 1st Canadian Army Tank Brigade wore this special version. Formation patches were worn on the upper arm, below the unit flash, and above any badge of rank. The khaki beret was an item of headdress only recently introduced. Its use was not yet widespread, and it seems to be worn by senior ranks, officers, and senior NCOs mostly. Now that we know what to look for, we can examine the photograph with these features in mind. Something to remember as we move through the examination of the photograph is not only to pay attention to what we do see, but equally as important, what we do not, what is conspicuous in its absence. As we launch into this examination, it must be understood that not all men wore all the necessary insignia. They were typically issued 2 sets of battle dress, and one would be kept fully badged, while the other often had no or very little insignia, often only the rank. So as we begin to pick up details of uniform, we have to expect that we won't always see a man's full unit designation. Also, bear in mind that privates at this time did not have a badge of rank. There were many headdresses shown in the photograph. As for tam o' shanters, the distinctive mark of a Seaforth, there are none, anywhere. Examples of visible field service caps are few, but readily identifiable. Black berets are enormously evident, but their khaki cousins are, like the TOS, absent. There are a few readily identifiable shoulder flashes, mostly Service Corps, and a similar number of formation patches. These bear the shape and coloring of the 1st Canadian Armoured Brigade. All the men seated are junior ranks, that is to say privates, lance corporals, or corporals, and there are a few chevrons visible. Lastly, senior NCOs are present, standing, or serving. In all, there are 31 items identifiable in the photo on a total of 28 men, none with the hallmarks of a Seaforth. The next aspect to examine is the atmospheric nature of the photo. As we move around the image, we must judge the condition of the men, their uniforms, the presence of kit or weapons, and the overall vibe of the picture. In all instances, the men are clean, shaven, and fresh-looking, many with their hair slicked back or neat haircuts. Their uniforms are, as the men in them, clean and neat, if not necessarily turned out for a parade or guard. Notwithstanding the odd collar button undone or pocket unbuttoned, these men are certainly in fresh uniforms and have not just crawled out of a blown-up building where they were fighting for their lives. Plaster dust, brick residue, sweat, or even blood are all conspicuous in their absence. Changing clothes was not part of the rotation of the companies, and indeed they were to go back into the line upon completion of their dinner. Another aspect noticeable in its absence is the total lack of weapons and personal kit. Not even a web belt or helmet is to be seen. Although the dinner was technically behind the front line by a few hundred yards, life in the battle zone would see the men's weapons and kit kept close at hand, perhaps piled neatly off to the side or slung on the back of chairs, or perhaps not even doffed at all, some preferring just to keep it all on. For 63 men to be only yards from the Germans, and to be unarmed with not one helmet seen anywhere, is somewhat unthinkable. Coincidental with the generally fresh nature of the men we are looking at, the stress of battle is not at all evident here. Tiredness, exhaustion, quiet contemplation, or the characteristic 1,000-yard stare, all dominant in troops recently in action, are all not to be seen. While recollections of laughter and a degree of relaxation, or perhaps rather more accurately stated as relief, are evident throughout most first-person accounts of the dinner, they are always accompanied with the overt signs of men recently removed from close contact with the enemy, and do not describe the light, relaxed atmosphere exhibited in this photograph. On the subject of atmospherics, perhaps it would be illustrative to show some examples from primary source documents. Here, from the Battalion War Diary. No one had looked for a celebration this day. December 25th was to be another day of hardship, discomfort, fear, and danger. Another day of war. The expression on the faces of the dirty, bearded men as they entered the building was a reward that those responsible are never likely to forget. It is that one line that is particularly poignant in our discussion. The expression on the faces of the dirty, bearded men. This, of course, begs the question, where are these beasts from battle returning? They certainly aren't in the photograph. And here from the diary of the Padre Roy Durnford. This is full of vivid details. First was C Company. He talks of the faces of the replacements new to war and the tables set in the church. A Company is next, under their officer commanding Captain June Thomas. Weary, stained, and dirty. More new men, looks of reluctance, that far-away look, the nervous strain, even slight inebriation. Then B Company. Talk of battle. Dirty plates piled up on top of the altar, with cooking going on right behind it. The men eating in the main body of the church. Carols, guns, vibrations of near explosions, combined with laughter and news of deaths. Wireless messages and yelling conversations heard over the radio net from a battle that could be heard just outside. Finally, at 5 p.m., D Company. Candlelight carols, anxiousness at the light emitting from the church, and talk of the fighting to be found in Ortona. Colonel Sid Thompson, the acting commanding officer of the Seaforths during the battle, would later state, "But the spirit of the occasion, the look on the faces of those exhausted, gutsy men on entering the church, is with me today and will live forever." Do these references match what we see in the photograph? Decidedly not. There is perhaps one more atmospheric point to mention. One of those awkward truths that rears its head here is that the church was in mortar range of the Germans. They had, after all, bombarded the church only a couple of days before. So why on earth would 60-plus men be seated in daylight, presumably if not in full view, then certainly exposed to a degree to the Germans who were still in the lower town? The answer, of course, is you wouldn't. If you were going to gather in this way, you would conceal your actions, say, inside a church. We've looked at the uniforms and atmospherics, which both seem to indicate certain things that don't translate into what we would expect to see from Seaforths at their dinner, but there are many more parts to the examination. As we move on to those, it is important that we can identify certain men in the photo for future reference. Now, I've gone through and labeled some individuals based on personal appearance or characteristics. Some names are playful in nature and do not reflect negatively on the memory of the man in question. Starting on the left side of the photograph, we see a bald man, and next to him, Dracula with a pointed hairline. The bald man with skeletal features is so named, and perhaps more pedestrian, the blond man in coveralls, the only man wearing black ones. Next to him, a man with a widow's peak hairline, and across the table, a man with a white collar. At the bottom, a man with a very high and tight haircut, and next to him, a man with an orange balanced on his bottle of beer. Moving around the corner, we have cigarette in ear, and up the right side, a man with a balding spot wearing a leather jerkin, a commonly seen garment in wintertime. Across the table, a man in a light-colored shirt, odd in a sea of battle dress, and at the inside of the upper corner, a man reaches for a mess tin. Inside of the upper leg, beret and coveralls, tan this time, sits across from someone who has a very big smile. Now, I believe the evidence uncovered thus far is telling unto itself, with not one Seaforth, but many others identified. But as this discussion develops, this rabbit hole hasn't even begun to show its depth and complexity. It's all fine and dandy to examine a photo in minute detail, with the hopes of gaining insight as to what it is of, but we must also consider that it was a picture taken on a roll of film. And we should definitely look at those other pictures if they're available. If one admittedly famous photo was taken at a frontline dinner, perhaps there are more. Thankfully, due in large part to the efforts of Dale Gervais, a now retired senior film conservator at the Library and Archives Canada, we now have access to just that, the roll of film this iconic image is found on. This most famous of photographs is found, along with the other images from the same roll, in volume 66 of the 110-volume Army Numerical Series, a comprehensive collection and catalogue of the wartime photography of the Canadian Army Film and Photograph Unit. Volume 66, dating from December 1943. The photo bears the serial number 28036 and is accompanied by 8 other photographs. Right off the bat, the album's page number 41 reveals startling details. The heading for the page states categorically, but somewhat uncharacteristically of most, the date, the photographer, Terry Rowe, the general heading of the subject of the photos, and lastly, the real revelation: Christmas at San Vito Marina. As one would expect from Army photographers in the age of film cameras, each frame is serialized and has a caption attached to it. Roll 71, taken in San Vito by Terry Rowe, shows the following captions. Reproduced here by Ben Moogk. Details in yellow refer to specific men and units. Those in purple, locations. Orange denotes details contrary to those associated with the Seaforth Ortona dinner, and, most tellingly in red, a description of the famous photo, number 28036. It being a general view of brigade headquarters at Christmas dinner, other ranks only. In other words, this dinner is for the men and not officers. Again, very typical of a men's Christmas dinner. We can certainly infer, due to the mention of it in the other captions, that the brigade mentioned here is indeed the 1st Canadian Armoured Brigade, or 1st Canadian Army Tank Brigade by its former name. Well, how about that? We have a picture that doesn't show anyone from the unit in question. We now have it placed in San Vito, Italy, and is of a brigade headquarters Christmas dinner. Alas, to quote a common late-night infomercial phrase, but wait, there's more. We should, in all thoroughness, examine the other photographs, as perhaps, as some have said, the group photograph is a one-off or one-shot deal, taken amidst the chaos of battle. Here, we'll examine each of the associated photographs and place them in the context of the main photo, by the men in them or by features shown. The first two we'll look at, numbers 28034 and 28033, are of men sitting outside the frame of the main photograph. But as we'll see, there are features of them important to their association with their more famous cousin. Firstly, there are shoulder titles and formation patches seen in 2 of the 3 men, a Service Corps flash and a Tank Brigade formation patch with the signals annotation, both non-Seaforth. Both have views of the distinctive balustrade we saw in the main photo, admittedly here in much better detail, and include a view of the unique flower pots found on the top rail of it. There is a tarp of a vehicle on the outside of the balustrade, indicating its general height, and please take notice of the view of the sea in the background. This is a low aspect shot, taken very close to sea level, and certainly not from the top of a 200-foot cliff, as we would expect if somehow taken at the church, that courtyard being walled off completely from view of the sea. Note, too, the lattice-type telephone or telegraph pole in the middle distance. In frame number 28035, we get our first opportunity to match it to the main photograph. Note the part in the hair of the man at the right, and the corresponding view of him in the main photograph, bordered in yellow. In addition, the arrangement of mess tins, oranges, cups and the like on the table matches up nicely. We also see a Tank Brigade formation patch circled in yellow. Details of note are the exposed buttons of the battle dress jacket of the man in the middle. This denotes a British set of battle dress, which is corroborated by the picture caption in that it states this is Trooper Jones, a British guest from Nottingham, England. We can see a Christmas tree in the background and a glimpse of the brickwork of a building differing from that of the retaining wall in the main photograph, as well as the obvious doorway. In frame 28037, we have another interesting sea view. At the lower left, we can see Monkey's Bum and Jerkin, who we find is a corporal with a tank brigade formation patch, as well as light-colored shirt, and the man next to him with a scarcity of hair. Clearly this too is of the same gathering. Note the peculiar stack of oranges on the table. As we look out over the men, we can see what appears to be a gap in the balustrade, and more of the unique flower pots. The view aspect to the sea is consistent with that found in the previously viewed frame 28033, that being very low, and the damaged breakwater again in the distance. The lines above also betray the same location. Frame 28030 shows 6 men seated facing the camera, but only 2 can be placed in the main photograph: Baldy and Dracula, the remaining men being cut out of the frame by the photographer. We see more tank brigade patches circled in red and purple, and, consistent with the Christmas dinner tradition, 2 sergeants, one wearing the distinctive black beret, and at the left edge the crown of a WO2 serving the men. Although taken at a slightly different time, again very obviously, this is of the same event. In the background, we can see the kiddie table and the balustrade. Frame 28031 shows a similar view to frame 28035. Our British friend at left, and we can see Cigarette in Ear, who is a corporal with a tank brigade patch, as well as a view of part on the left. The officer serving also sports a tank brigade patch with the recognizable RCCS across the center, standard designation for signals at the tank brigade headquarters. Also, in a supremely trivial moment, Cigarette in Ear appears to be the only man eating off an actual plate. Behind them, the same building with its brickwork. Frame 28032 is a real eye-opener. Skeletor, Blondie in coveralls, white collar, high and tight, and orange on beer can all be seen, as well as another tank brigade patch in red. Importantly, this view shows the height of the retaining wall, that there is a structure actually up on top of it. It gives a better view of the Christmas tree in the corner, the full doorway, the brickwork, the fact that there is a second story to the building, and most importantly, the white sign advertising Cafe e Vino. This is the wine shop mentioned in the captions and is 100% not a church. If it were, though, I'd be the first parishioner, I can tell you. Maybe it was a secret weapon the priest used to get the townsfolk of Ortona to come up the hill on Sundays, but I digress. Incidentally, we can see the edge of a window frame at the right edge of the photo, juxtaposed to the doorway. Frame 28029 shows our tanker sergeant in his black beret doing his duty and serving the men, who are identifiable as Smiley, and the man in the shirt next to him. We see another tank brigade patch and a field service cap, and importantly, an extra man who evidently was not in his seat when the main photograph was taken. This man is a service corps type with his shoulder flash and field service cap tucked under his shoulder strap. He also wears a tank brigade patch. The olive tree and wall are prominent in the background. In addition to the 8 associated photos found on Rose Roll 71, there were cine film taken of the event, presumably by Sergeant Norm Quick, Rose number 2. There are 3 clips to be currently found, and we should also verify that these 2 are of the same event in the same way. Any location or environmental details we'll be able to see will also be useful. In this still, we see a reverse angle of the main table, and we can confirm a few more black berets and shoulder flashes that we couldn't see before. All the usual cast of characters are present, including Baldy, white collar, blonde in coveralls, and the reclining widow's peak beside him. Orange on beer and beret in coveralls are also easily spotted. Clearly, this is of the same dinner. Key details are the tangle of branches at the bottom of the frame, indicating that this was taken from a position above the olive tree and other branches, seen growing against the retaining wall. We can see the balustrade in good detail, and an obvious gap, presumably enclosing a staircase or exit off the patio. Most interestingly, standing in this gap is a man with a camera. We can't see his face, but he is positioned roughly to frame the main photograph. Is this Terry Rowe? The story goes that Rowe did not want to climb up to get the elevation necessary for the shot that became the main picture. He instead passing the camera to Norm Quick, who actually snapped the photo. Having said that, we can probably surmise that the man taking the cine film is Norm Quick, and that this was filmed after the iconic photograph was taken. Having taken the shot, Quick passed the camera back to Rowe, then took his cine camera up onto the retaining wall to further film the gathering. Behind the cameraman, hard to discern, is the front of a CMP, or Canadian Military Pattern Truck, and the roll of something we can see is in fact a roll of barbed wire covered in hessian, a common way to carry such an item. This leads to another interesting theory of where the photograph was actually taken from. Was it snapped from the top of a truck? More on that later. The same atmospherics are extant here as they were in the main photograph, as indeed this is the same event. Joy, relaxation, and camaraderie are the order of the day, quite the antithesis of men recently relieved from intense battle. Another clip shows our orange on beer, with High and Tight eating their meal. The orange, of course, is very pronounced, as is the balustrade behind. The final clip shows the wine shop sign and a few new black berets. Monkey's bum and jerkin is at the lower right, and reaching for mess tin, circled in red, is revealed to be carrying a black beret in his shoulder strap. The wall, building, and sign are all eminently visible. In the actual clip, another tanker with his black beret stuffed into his shoulder strap moves past, distributing oranges. There is one more image to bring into the fold, and that is of Norm Quick and Andy Anderson, standing having a beer, leaning up against that same balustrade. Though taken later, in early 1944, again, this photo shows the now common details of the location. The balustrade, the flower pots, the lattice-type pole and lines, and perhaps the best indication of the proximity and aspect to the sea. One could almost throw a stone into the Adriatic. So, with all that analysis complete, I believe it can be stated categorically that the roll of film was taken at the same place, at the same event, at the location stated, and not atop a 200-foot cliff in a walled courtyard. To summarize the identification of the men in all of the photographs, and the reasons why, I compiled this diagram. Of the 64 men in the photograph, fully 32 are identifiable as specifically non-Seaforth, with the majority showing a positive identification to the headquarters of the 1st Canadian Army Tank Brigade by badge or headdress. In the associated photographs, 10 men who are not in the main photograph have specifically non-Seaforth features matching those found in the main photograph. One of the aspects that has become commonplace in the narrative used to support the claim that the photo was at the church is that the dinner was somehow attended by all and sundry, as though it was a food court at a mall. Gangs of hungry soldiers smelling food and heading in for a much appreciated meal. This would be patently false. There were other non-Seaforths at the dinner, is a commonly rehearsed anecdote. Sure, the signallers, clerks, and cooks of battalion headquarters and the odd attachment would have been present, as they normally would, in the battalion echelon, but not 50-plus personnel from units outside the division, let alone the battalion. A battalion headquarters during the war was not some sort of sprawling command center with hundreds of men from countless units acquiescing under the antenna farm. The major attachments, i.e. the tanks, would have had their own chains of command and supply to sustain their men. This nebulous claim is made to explain away some uncomfortable truths that become evident when the photo is examined. This was a Seaforth event, and attention must be paid to the machinations of the Army in its ways of doing business. Ration plans, accountability, scales of issue, and chains of command were all conventions that needed to be adhered to. Meals would have been prepared against nominal rolls, with company parade states factoring into what and how much was to be cooked. No, this was by Seaforths for Seaforths, and not for anyone to just walk in the door. As a matter of fact, the War Diary of the Three Rivers Regiment states specifically that Christmas fare was sought and secured, but the serving of it would have to wait until more suitable circumstances prevailed. While the simple evidence presented in the photo album is quite sufficient to place the famous photograph in its correct location, it is another thing entirely to actually find that location in San Vito, as page 41 states. San Vito Chiantino is a small town some 6 kilometers as the crow flies south from Ortona. Its central feature is, like Ortona, a high coastal prominence of land, very common in this part of Italy. Atop this hill lies an older part of town, in which is found a square currently known as the Piazza Garibaldi. This and the municipal building at its end were used extensively by the Canadian Divisional Headquarters for administration and welfare. As the photographic record alludes to, it was used for its fair share of parades and ceremonies, quite typical of rear area headquarters type activities. The hills to the north of town, during the Battle of Ortona, were home to the gun positions of the Royal Canadian Artillery and Royal Canadian Horse Artillery, who consistently supported operations all along the 1st Division's front. Here we see dug-in 25-pounders and the medium 4.5 or 5.5-inch howitzers, very typical of the divisional and corps artillery. The 6-kilometer distance to Ortona was well within the 13,000-yard range of the 25-pounder. As alluded to in the photograph captions, it is a seaside location we are looking for and not a hilltop one. One with relatively easy vehicle access and unobstructed views of the Adriatic. Due in large part to Ben Moogk, who wrote the fundamental article on the subject, and a certain Andrea DeMarco who provided it, we have a period postcard which provides a huge clue as to where our photograph was taken. Giving the name of the street as Via Nazionale, or National in Italian, the postcard is unbelievable in its detail. Astonishingly, it can indeed be placed in the modern context. As the location pans into view, we can note the arrangement of the buildings on the right. The closest, with the 3 arches over the door and windows, has 2 balconies, whilst the 2-story building farther down has 3 balconies. At the end, the 3-story building has 2 balconies. As we can see, these buildings are all still standing. If we examine the other side of the street, we can see what appears to be a trattoria, indicated by the curved white painted lintel above the window, and importantly, its patio is surrounded by the exact same white balustrade, with the characteristic flower pots along the top rail. The building has 2 stories, and has the same style brickwork, with a drip edge between the stories. This is completely consistent with the views of the building seen in the photographs. Quite frankly, this is riveting stuff. Obviously, the building doesn't exist anymore, but we can place it in relationship to the apartments across the street as being where the blue building stands today. And the patio, now long gone, would have been where the upper roadway exists today, the balustrade in the approximate location of the guardrail. As we pan to the left, we see a stout brick retaining wall, which appears to be made in the same style as the one in the picture, complete with drainage holes. There appears to be an older part to the wall further down, and this would be consistent with the construction of the highway SS-16, which now runs around this corner, necessitating a reconstruction of the retaining wall farther back. Incidentally, it was this construction that necessitated the destruction of the patio and the trattoria building in the first place. As we pan out to the sea, it becomes immediately apparent that the view matches that found in the photographs, with a low aspect sea level angle, including the breakwater. Based on these discoveries, I searched about and found another period postcard, which further lent to my orientation of the area. On the outside, a simple view of the town from the area of the beach, the details here were eye-opening. Zooming in, we can actually see the trattoria or wine shop in its entirety. It is in fact 2 stories, and the curved white painted lintel is conspicuous on the right. Just as amazing is the white painted sign on the left face of the building, in the exact spot we found it in the associated photographs. There is a dark shape to the left of the building, indicating the presence of the retaining wall and the structure above it, and we can see the balustrade that wraps around the entire frontage of the building, consistent with both the photos and the earlier postcard, though resolution and perhaps age has blurred its details. Given this location, then, we can closely match the sea views with those found in the associated pictures of Roll 71. Believe it or not, I actually found other postcards from San Vito showing details of clearly the same location, although this one was from an earlier era. Here we can see the backs of the buildings across the street and the trattoria, looking like it did in 1943. Now that our analysis of the picture, the associated pictures, and the specific location has been completed, we can now place the photos in relation to the layout of the dinner. Now this diagram is not particularly to scale, but it is close enough to illustrate the point. All the main features are present. The retaining wall, the kiddie table, the jeep or other small vehicle next to the balustrade, the small two-man table, the main table with the olive tree, vines, and Christmas tree behind it, the building with its distinctive white signage on the appropriate faces, the two gaps with stairs in the balustrade found in the postcard and photographs, the CMP truck nosed in at the left-hand staircase, the white balustrade, and the buildings across the street. Also of note are the lattice-type telephone poles across the street towards the sea. There are a couple of theories regarding the exact positioning of the cameraman, who we have learned was actually Norm Quick. The general aspect, of course, is the same. Ben Moogk, in his article, surmises that the photo was taken from across the street, from a balcony on one of the buildings. To me, this seems to be a bit too far away to allow for the relatively steep angle that the photo was taken at. Another theory is that it is in fact the balustrade that was used as the perch, given the height of it and proximity to it in relation to the sitting men and the apparent distance from them that the camera seems to be. I believe this to be somewhat erroneous. This would place the men at the bottom of the photograph quite literally at the toes of a man standing on the balustrade. But if the balustrade is too close and the balcony across the street is a little bit too far away, what else would give such a high angle yet be distant enough to capture all of it? Once I was able to determine that there was a truck in the background outside the balustrade, my chips went towards the use of it or another nearby to gain the height above the balustrade and angle to catch most of the table, with the wall and kiddie table behind. In the end, it is a nice and fun trivia point to argue, but not material to the overall argument of the location and timing of this particular event. Now we'll place the associated photographs. Frame 28029 was taken off the top left corner of the table, showing the corner of the table with the olive tree behind. Frame 28030 was taken at the lower left corner, looking across it and over to the kiddie table, just catching the backs of the men at the two-man table. Frame 28031 was taken across the lower right corner, with the wine shop door behind. 28032 was taken from just behind the lower left corner at the stairs, from very close to where we saw the cameraman in the still from the motion picture of the group. Frame 28033 was taken with the main table to the rear, looking out to sea. 28035 was from back at the lower right corner. And 28037 was taken from the area of the Christmas tree, backed into the corner of the retaining wall. This cine clip was taken from the close confines between the table and the building. This one was filmed from the top left corner between the main and kiddie tables. And finally, the group shot was filmed from atop the retaining wall, overlooking the patio. The similar height and resultant aspect of this framing is so similar to that of the main photograph that to me, the top of the truck theory as to where the main photograph was taken is most probable. This would lend the intermediate height necessary to photograph over the balustrade, but still include those at the kiddie table. So there you have it. The analysis is complete. In regards to the picture, we determined who is in it and who is not, where it was taken, and in what circumstances. In regards to the associated pictures, we determined that they are of the same event, that they further illustrate who is in attendance at this event and who is not, and they are important in that they develop the understanding of the location of the event. As far as the location goes, we know that the documentation says that the picture was taken in San Vito. We have further placed that picture in the exact spot within the town. And, perhaps as icing on the cake, we've been able to place the cameraman in the exact position from where he took all of the images, be they still or motion picture. Now that we've determined the true details of the photos, what of all those people and agencies that purport this image was taken at the Church of Santa Maria de Constantinople and feature Seaforths identified as sitting at the table? Let's look at some notable contrary theories. Perhaps the first thing to mention in regards to the argument for the picture being at the church is that quite clearly the picture is not in a church. Now, the argument then shifts to one of the picture being taken in the courtyard of the church. I believe this to have been constructed in order to place the photo at the church to some degree, and sold suggestively to veterans and the public alike, who apparently were unaware that such a space even existed. But I suppose we should, in good faith, try to place the photo and its key features in the context of the church courtyard. For this, we only really have three key features to draw on: the curved and battered retaining wall, the tight corner of the balustrade, and an elevated position from which to take the picture. Now, I'll attempt to place the photo exclusive of the details that we now know to be true, revealed in the associated photographs, just by way of exercise, as we should, in all honesty, be able to prove or disprove the picture's place in the courtyard on its own merits, wouldn't you say? But once that is done, I will certainly add some of the details that we already know to be true. Just where does a nice clean patio, white balustrade, a wine shop with distinctive brickwork, sea views, and the proximity to the water fit into this? Perhaps that is just a bit rhetorical. For the sake of the exercise, though, if the picture is in the church courtyard, then which wall is this? Was it taken up against the parallel annex or cloister? Well, by the photographic record, that doesn't curve, and the wall of that structure is straight, so no. Besides, that would put the balustrade into the corner near the L annex, which makes no sense whatsoever. Besides, why would there be a white cast concrete or marble balustrade in the middle of a courtyard anyway? But in order to paint an even better picture, let's introduce a couple of the associated photographs. The Cafe e Vino picture shows very clearly that to the right of the picture there lies the wall of a building. There is no such building to the north of the north wall. And we know the view off to the left of the picture is in fact a sea view, which in this case would be completely blocked by the L annex. And if we apply the view we see from the cinefilm, we know that to the bottom of the picture would be the white balustrade, not the wall of a courtyard. Was the picture taken up against the L annex? Again, that structure is straight and not curved. And then we come across the even more difficult task of placing the balustrade in the same position that the wall of the courtyard is. Now we know the wall of the building with the coffee and wine sign stands to the right of the photograph, and this would place it up against the church. But again, what kind of church sells coffee and wine? As well, what about the structure on top of the retaining wall? Is this some sort of structure on top of the L annex? Absolutely not. And how you can get a view of the sea that looks like this, looking off to the left of the photograph, is beyond me, unless, of course, you can see through the wall and down a 200-foot cliff. So, no, the picture was not taken up against the L annex. Was the picture taken up against the east wall of the courtyard? Well, this would certainly facilitate an elevated position to take the picture from, as that could have been done from the parallel annex or cloister. But, yet again, we come across the uncomfortable truth that the wall in the photograph is curved. Not to mention an absolutely ridiculous location to put a cast concrete balustrade. When we apply the associated photographs, we do indeed see a structure to the right of the photograph in this case. However, the structure that is shown on top of the retaining wall would be hanging in space if it were above the east wall of the courtyard. And there is no sea view to the left in this case because that points straight into town. So no, it wasn't taken against the eastern wall of the courtyard. So this leaves us with one more option. Was the picture taken up against the north wall of the courtyard? Now, this could possibly afford some sort of elevation, the picture perhaps being taken from the L annex. But, I know I'm sounding like a broken record here, but again, we have no curved wall, and placing a white balustrade in this corner next to the annex just defies logic. The Cafe e Vino picture doesn't work because there's no structure to the right, and there sure as hell is not a sea view to the left, unless of course it was painted on the side of the annex. So no, the picture was not taken against the north wall of the courtyard. So, with the most basic of deductions, we can see that the photo was not taken at the church. Does this picture look like those taken at the church and its surroundings? Where is the smashed masonry, the dust, the dirt, the evidence of fighting? After all, the Germans defended the church during the 20th and 21st of December. Surely there was still evidence of this come the 25th. The simple fact is that it wasn't taken at the church. Now, we knew that already, but this particular exercise is important to address the claims of some that it was in the courtyard that this photo was taken. Which of course then begs this rhetorical question. That during a dinner held in a damaged church, with 4 sittings of dozens of men each, battle raging nearby, carols being sung, pipes played, and organ music pumping from within, did the photographer choose to take one photograph of supposedly a grouping of men sitting outside in a courtyard? If that was the case, then Terry Rowe and Norm Quick should have been fired. Ernie Bagstad was indeed a Seaforth and did attend the Ortona dinner as a member of either C or D Company. Accounts vary. Now, D Company attended after dark, so more on that later. So let's suppose Ernie was in C Company, attending earlier in the day. The man purported to be him is in fact our reaching for mess tin man. As we have discovered with close examination of the photo and cinefilm that accompanies it, this man has a black beret, as do so many others, rolled and stuffed into his shoulder strap. And this makes him a tank man, not a Seaforth. Sadly, this is not Ernie Bagstad. Another man claimed to be in the photo is Jock Gibson. Also a Seaforth, Jock was promoted from sergeant to acting warrant officer class 2 or WO2 on the 10th of December 1943 as part of his appointment as acting company sergeant major of D Company. In the picture, he is claimed to be sitting at the top corner and is in fact our Smiley of earlier designation. The badge of a WO2 was a Tudor crown worn on the lower sleeve of the battle dress jacket. This is not visible on this man's sleeve. In fact, earlier in the presentation, we caught a glimpse of an actual WO2 serving the men, caught on camera in frame 28030. It is claimed that during the dinner he, quote, looked up and someone took a picture, and that this is evident in the photograph. Upon closer examination, our Smiley is in fact looking in the same direction as most everybody else is, at the commotion at the right of the table. He is not looking up, but rather craning his head to see around those in between to get a better glimpse of what's going on over on the right. In fact, not one man is looking at the camera. The next point to consider is somewhat more arcane, but no less, actually, in fact, more important. Suppose that this is Jock sitting down for dinner. He is the company sergeant major of D Company. So, where are his men? Why is he sitting down with privates of the Armored Corps and Service Corps? And why is he being served by a tanker sergeant? There is no company sergeant major in the army who, having husbanded his company through days of bitter street fighting, with an unknown number of days ahead of the same, would have arrived at Christmas dinner with his company, and then left his men to sit down in a different location and eat with privates of completely different units, only to be served by a sergeant of the Armored Corps from a completely different formation. That, in fact, was his job to do, not to be served. He was to look after his men and not partake until all had their due. If he had done this, and I don't believe for 1 second that he did, after all, Jock Gibson seems to have been a good man, and he was chosen to be Company Sergeant Major for a reason, he would have been fired on the spot. Now, some of the anecdotal evidence doesn't necessarily point to these strict observances of officers and NCOs serving the men of their company. The personnel of regimental headquarters took great pride in providing for the men of the rifle companies, doing everything in their power to make the 2 hours they were spending in the church as meaningful and restful as possible. That said, the generalities surrounding the appropriate husbandry of their men would necessarily have been observed completely. The officers and NCOs would have eaten last. The final nail in the coffin of this claim is one of timing. Through the magic of the internet, the time of sunset in Ortona on Christmas Day 1943 was 16:35 hours. With the sun dipping behind the distant mountains further inland somewhat earlier, dusk and eventual darkness would have prevailed near 1700 hours. As mentioned earlier, the companies rotated one at a time, with D Company being last. Their time slot was 17 to 1900 hours. Given that the photography of the moment could not yield good results in any kind of low light without copious amounts of artificial light, and that the picture and the associated pictures are obviously taken in good quality daylight, this picture is not of D Company, and this man, our Smiley, is not Jock Gibson. William Challen was identified by his family as being in the picture facing left at the inside of the bottom corner. Private Challen wasn't even in the battalion until 2 days later. He was a transfer, like a number of others, from the Perth Regiment, as shown in the war diary. Now, if the dinner was in San Vito in the rear, where HQs of various formations were, there might have actually been a possibility that a replacement such as him, 2 days away from joining his new unit, actually may have been in attendance at a Christmas dinner held behind the lines, waiting in limbo and told to go to dinner along with the other junior ranks. On the surface, this would seem to make complete sense, and one of the only possible claims that holds any validity. Well, it's close, but not close enough. Not only would that place Private Challen not in Ortona, and therefore the picture would not be there as well, but upon closer examination, this man is wearing a tank brigade patch, and therefore not of the Perth Regiment, which was an infantry unit. Like everyone else in the photograph, this man is a member of the headquarters of the 1st Canadian Armoured Brigade, and he is not William Challen. The final case we'll look at is that of Harry Impey. Harry was a Seaforth, making his way into the battalion after joining the army in Ontario, a common occurrence, especially later in the war. The man in this photograph has distinctive light-colored shoulder titles, not Seaforth ones, and, quite frankly, does not match the image I found of him on a memorial lamppost banner. The jawline, quite pronounced in the verified image, does not match that of our man in the photo. So Harry, too, is not in the photograph. Apart from specific claims regarding individuals, there also exists in some circles the supposition that a certain documentary holds key footage to the dinner. This is entitled Canada at War, and it is the chapter titled The Road to Ortona that we are concerned with. This series was produced in the early 1960s and is very much a documentary of the era. It should be noted that throughout it is a storytelling endeavor and not a serious and specific exposition of defined events. Throughout, the documentary uses footage from different battles, different years, different countries, and different forces, all in the effort to tell the story of Ortona, but certainly not to document it. Here we see Commonwealth troops fighting in some sort of village. They are, however, carrying Sten guns, which were not used in Italy in 1943. This clip is famously from the fighting in Cologne in 1945, and this clip shows a wounded man being evacuated next to a Sherman Firefly, which wasn't even in production. This footage coming from Normandy. This footage is actually of German paratroopers, but probably comes from the fighting around Cassino. And these Germans are not paratroopers. This clip actually is from Ortona, and taken at the Piazza Vittoria. The footage of tanks here is also from the Ortona area, and we can see them maneuvering at the Piazza Vittoria. Then we cut to a scene from the fighting in Cologne in 1945. This is in fact the famous duel between the Panther tank and the Pershing tank, fought in 1945 near the cathedral. The Germans had no Panthers at Ortona. The Christmas dinner segment then starts. Generic images of food preparation and soldiers being issued beer and other festive gifts then are shown. Tank men from the Armored Corps and other infantry units within the 1st Division. As you can see, they all allude to a nice cheery atmosphere at the front during Christmas time. Now we see the clips of the dinner that we've examined in detail in this presentation. That, of course, being the Christmas dinner of the headquarters of the 1st Canadian Armoured Brigade. Now is interjected actual footage of the Seaforths in Ortona. Taken early in the battle, these are troops coming back to the church. Then we have this shot of men queuing up to receive a special meal of some sort, be it Christmas or otherwise. There are many shoulder titles and units present, none of whom are Seaforths. Interestingly enough, these clips here are showing New Zealand soldiers fighting at Cassino. The last half of the documentary relies heavily on scenes taken from a training film, teaching troops how to fight in built-up areas. Though interesting and very atmospheric in its own right, this is not Ortona, though it is being used to represent that town and the fighting therein. There are some more clips from Ortona, tanks of the Three Rivers Regiment advancing down the Corso Emanuele. There's even a short clip of the vehicles destroyed on the 22nd of December next to the church. The chapter ends with a brief address by Matthew Halton of the CBC, and shots of the Seaforths' burial of their dead next to the church of Santa Maria di Costantinopoli, which occurred in January of 1944. These are of course quite genuine, and show Pipe Major Ed Essen playing the lament next to the graves. So we can see how the story is being told in this documentary. But we also must keep in mind that the footage we see is not necessarily that of the story we are being told. At the risk of mimicking the ending of Return of the King, and yes, there have been multiple endings already, attention really must be paid to one other photograph that makes the rounds come Ortona season. We'll apply the same approach as we have with the others. As far as atmospherics go, it matches closely what we have seen already. There are no outward signs of stress or recent action. The men are clean, shaven, with well-kept hair. Their uniforms are very respectable in some cases, even creases shown in the trousers. Apart from a bit of mud on boots, there is no evidence that these men are even in the field. There are no weapons, no equipment seen, and no helmets. The men on the right are in fact dispatch riders in riding boots and breeches. As for uniforms, there are no tam o' shanters, and all the visible examples are field service caps or an instance of the rare khaki beret. We do not see any formation patches, strangely even on the staff sergeant seated to the left of the table, and what shoulder flashes we do see are service corps examples. We see one junior NCO, a lance corporal, and one senior NCO, a staff sergeant. We can draw the same conclusions as these observations led us to in the main photograph. They are not Seaforths, and this is therefore not Ortona. These are rear area men. Thankfully, just like the main photograph, we can contextualize this photograph with others using the Army Numerical Series albums, as it is found also in Volume 66. Now, the page description is not as telling as that found with Roll 71. Whitcomb is the photographer, and the Canadians in Italy is all we have to go on. There are associated photographs from the same roll, 10 in all, exclusive of the one in question. So, can we glean anything from them? In all cases, the pictures show rear area activities, and so we can rightly assume that the roll was generally taken in the same area, if not the same location. Bags of mail, the postie's jeep, and a festive gathering on the road under a very peculiar Christmas sign. In an effort to pin the location down, I cross-referenced photographs from the British Imperial War Museum collection and found this one taken by a Sergeant McConville on Christmas Day. Now there is no doubt that the sign is the same sign seen in the Canadian photograph, and thankfully a location is given. Funny enough, San Vito. So this picture, with all the associated photographs, was taken in or near San Vito and is consistent with the types of troops we would expect to see in and around a division headquarters. Never before has an event in military history, primarily involving only one regiment, been represented by a photograph that is used as evidence of that event without illustrating a single member of the unit in question. That is the stark reality of this discussion. The narrative that this is a photo of the Seaforth Ortona dinner has at its foundation the assumption that the photo is of the dinner. The anecdotal support, the stories and distant memories that the claims of authenticity nearly exclusively rely on, are simply made to fit the narrative. The square peg of fact is jammed so hard into the round hole of the anecdotal narrative that it sheds in the process all its corners as inconvenient chaff. So, they would say, there you have it. Round peg in round hole. The only problem is all those shards and chunks of the truth that are shorn off in the process, the pesky details, such as the presence of other photos that clearly show it is not an Ortona at the church, or by the time a certain individual who is claimed to be in the photo arrived for supper, it was after dark, are still there. Clearly, the narrative that the picture is of the dinner is false. The correct narrative does exist, however, with the proper square holes, as it were. When we look at all the references that exist to this picture being of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, found in books, on the internet, in articles, posted on information boards, as well as being presented orally during expositions, tours, and lectures, it is perhaps very daunting to question the very relationship between the Seaforths, the church, and this picture, or perhaps more starkly, to suggest that there isn't a relationship at all. In essence, how can so many websites, articles, and blogs be wrong? The answer lies in the subtle yet powerful transformation of first the picture becoming known, then being used as an evocation of the dinner, but then through an almost insatiable desire to have some record of the Seaforth dinner become of the dinner. This is combined with the unfortunate but near complete separation of the photograph's presentation with the necessary evidence and research to truly know where it's from. For instance, you can find the actual caption of the photograph on the Library and Archives website. There it states, as it did on the handwritten dope sheet and its subsequent typed transcription, typos notwithstanding, that photograph number 28036 is of a general view of brigade headquarters at Christmas dinner, taken on the 25th of December 1943 in San Vito, Italy. However, once the groundswell fully developed, fueled primarily by the internet, the incorrect presentation of the photograph became nearly unstoppable. What better combination, after all, than an impossible dinner held in the midst of battle and a picture of it to boot? Sadly, it is all erroneous. All of the hard evidence that has been examined today states conclusively that the picture is of the men of the headquarters of the 1st Canadian Armoured Brigade in San Vito, Italy, full stop. The documentary evidence, the environmental evidence shown in the photos, the physical evidence of badges and uniforms, and the circumstantial evidence of atmospherics all weigh in to support that argument. No one wishes to contradict the account of a veteran or someone who knew one, but it is what it is, and it is not the Seaforth Ortona dinner. The dinner would forever leave its mark on the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada. Borden Cameron would later be made a member of the Order of the British Empire for his work in making the first Ortona dinner a reality. The Seaforth Highlanders of Canada still observe the occasion of the Ortona dinner every year come Christmas time. The menu has remained remarkably consistent since 1943. Pork, mashed potatoes, Vegetables, mince pie, chocolate, and oranges all take their place next to the ration of beer for every member. Though not held on the battlefield, the memory and commemoration of it, and that of the men who fought and died in faraway Italy, are forever remembered. I hope that you have enjoyed this rather in-depth look at the story of the Ortona dinner of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada. Moreover, it has been written to ensure the reality of the photographic record is presented correctly and preserved. The accuracy of the history we all love and cherish should, after all, be as truthful as possible, and although we would all be most appreciative of some record, any record of that historic dinner, there exists none but in the minds of those who are sadly passed on. Lest we forget.
In the aftermath of every battle comes the poignant task of caring for those men who lost their lives. Following the bitter hand-to-hand fighting at Ortona, the Seaforths of Canada put to rest their war-weary comrades. Gathered at the graveside with the chaplain, the men stand in silent tribute with the words of the lesson read by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton, echoing across the battle-scarred resting place. As the strains of the last post fade across the Adriatic, the Seaforths seal the graves of their comrades with flowers of the forest. This bit of earth in foreign soil, this resting place from strife and toil, from blood and sweat and tears, refuted, well-loved, remembered always.
The references used in the making of this video were primarily the albums of the Army Numerical Series found at Library and Archives Canada, Ben Moock's article on the subject found at the website canadianfilmandphotounit.ca, the War Diary of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, and various historical images and reels, including some aerial photos from ncap.org.uk. Before we close off this lengthy video, I must address an awkward truth myself. At the time of publishing of this video, the website of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada has an article that very much supports the claim that the photo was taken at the church in Ortona. After careful clarification with them, I am assured that the current body of evidence now in existence is what the unit is moving forward with, and that the mention of the dinner and the picture shall be placed in the correct context. All of this will be published when the new website is up and running. If you want to know more about the Battle of Ortona, then run, don't walk, and enter the name Jason Giroux in YouTube. Major Giroux is the foremost Canadian expert in urban warfare and is of international renown. He is presented numerous times in his capacity both as a soldier and on various YouTube channels. You will not be disappointed. He presents with the perfect balance between the eye and sensibilities of a soldier and a completely approachable style that will keep any historical enthusiast or urban warfare prodigy entertained for hours. And of course, thanks must be extended to the Museum of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, who helped greatly with some of the research for this project. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. For more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page. What was once Utreon is now Player. It still remains a good alternative to YouTube and Patreon, as those platforms have become rather troublesome for content as found on this channel. May I suggest following British Muzzleloaders there as well. If you'd like to view British Muzzleloaders and many other channels in an ad-free environment, free from the content restraints of YouTube and other platforms, then I might suggest you head on over to History of Weapons and War, where you can subscribe and find this channel and many like it, presented as they should be, all in one place.